After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and knight c3, the 3 knights game is on the board. Black goes on with f5. And in this video, we're going to go through pawn takes, as in the previous one. And now, as mentioned, knight f6 is the move. But now we're going to go through bishop to b5. So the difference from the previous video is that in the previous video, we went through bishop c4. Here, we're going to go through bishop b5. Now, as I mentioned as well, bishop c4 is not a transposition into an Italian. Bishop b5 is not a transposition into a Spanish game. The order of the move is different, but it's not a transposition because there's threats that you're making. But let's make a practical example. Black move now is e4. Now you might be wondering, okay, look, this looks exactly the same. It's maybe not the same because of the knight c3 and knight f6 move that have been played, but it looks really similar. Well, the difference is that now white can play knight g5 and there are 2 attackers to this pawn. It still looks very similar because now black plays d5, but it's not the exact same. Obviously now we're defending the pawn, and after d3, attacking the pawn and trying to challenge the very strong black center, also because black was threatening h6, black indeed plays h6. And now in this position, it's already compromised for the white player. There's 2 options here, with either knight to h3 or a sacrifice of the pawn, which I've seen a lot, but it doesn't go anywhere. Or also knight e6. We're going to look at all of them, and then we're going to go to the next lines. The sacrifice is a bit crazy, but just so you know how to deal with it, pawn takes, we take the knight, so it's all fine. And now pawn takes in d5. This is the second pawn that white grabs in exchange of the knight, plus the knight in c6 is pinned by the bishop. So black obviously goes on with a6. If white takes us, we can take the bishop back. And so we're not losing anything. We also have a possibility to swap queens and play the endgame with an extra piece. We should be winning. So let's look at 2 options now. Bishop to a4, you just obviously play queen to e7 check. And after white blocks, you play b5 attacking the bishop moves, and that's it. You just have an extra piece. If instead white plays this move, which is another sacrifice of the other knight, take, and then bishop takes, the white player gave 2 knights for 4 pawns, but should be winning a piece now, and so it looks like a really interesting move, but this loses the game now because queen to b4 just settles it. It's a check, and so this is a fork. And by the way, in this position, after a6 was played attacking the bishop, what happens if instead white gives us a check first? Okay, well, it's almost a transposition. Queen e7, just block the check, and now you're renewing your threat on the bishop, so bishop to a4 has to happen anyway. Okay, queen takes, and then knight takes, and now b5. The bishop has to go, and then knight a5, obviously trying to take this very strong bishop. And now the bishop can recapture the pawn in g5, but look, at the end of all of this, black is up a piece, there is no compensation. Black also goes on with taking the pawn in f5, and after, if white were to castle long, black will also castle long, is the best move, and then go on to win the endgame. If white plays knight to d4 attacking the bishop, simply bishop back to d7, and after castle, bishop to d6, these are just exemplar moves. h3 by white and then castle. This is just how to consolidate the already obtained advantage into a winning endgame. You're free to win the bishop at any time you want from the opponent. If he ever tries to stop you from doing that, like c3 for example, then you can swap the bishop, the knight for the bishop, go on to win the endgame. So from the start, we're playing the 3 knights game, and we're playing f5, and we're looking at the variation where the pawn takes, knight moves, and bishop to b5. Let's call it the pseudo-Spanish, whatever. Okay, so now we push the pawn immediately, and after knight to g5, d5. So now black plays h6, and let's look at knight h3 for example. Okay, we capture the pawn in f5, and now we're also stopping the white player from being able to castle, because whenever that happens, you can take the knight in h3. It will be a very, very good move. So after knight back to f4, putting more pressure over d5 and also reinserting itself into the game, black goes on with bishop to d6. White doesn't have to worry about this knight being attacked because it's protected by the bishop. Let's look at 2 options now. Obviously, a normal developing move for the opponent, let's say bishop to e3, simply loses because of d4. This knight is a loose piece, remember. Yes, the knight in c6 is pinned, so it looks like the bishop can take the pawn for free in order to avoid the fork of these two, but you can just take the knight. So in this position, bishop e3 is not possible. A move like bishop to d2 to try and play queen e2 and then castle alongside. Black castles. And now queen e2 is already a problem, because then you're threatening to take the pawn in d3 and play rook e8. It's too strong of a threat. So after short castle, let's see how wrong things go when that happens. Now we're exploiting this thematic e4 pawn move. We have a pawn in e4 attacking f3 and d3. And in this position with the misplaced knight, always remember this move. Bishop to g4. Right? Now the queen just has to move. White cannot push because you got this threat of simply taking. You're devastating the king side of our opponent. So after queen e1, knight to d4, it's attacking it's putting pressure on the bishop, but it's threatening, most importantly, pawn to c2 and the pawn in c2 and then fork queen and rook. White's best move would be pawn takes in e4. The reason is simple. If white just plays bishop to a4 to stop the knight from approaching c2, or maybe the rook to c1 or something like that, knight f3 is the blow that wins the game. Boom! It's an incredible move. You're checking the king, you're attacking the queen, so that means the pawn has to take your knight, but then bishop to f3 and you have a checkmate to happen very soon. The idea is to play queen c8 and then queen g4 and checkmate. And it's funny how this is all unstoppable. Nothing really works. Even knight to e2, for example, queen to c8 and knight to g3, well fine, then just remove this knight from the defense and then you're threatening queen to h3. So in this position, the white's best move would be pawn takes in order to remove our strong attacker of the square f3. The pawn is crucial in there. Now black takes back with the knight and the game is compromised. Remember, we also have a threat on c2 anytime we want. This knight in e4 is very powerful. It cannot be taken by the knight. Oh, and by the way, the fork in f3 doesn't work because knight c2 comes with an attack on the queen. The queen has to move away. You also have the possibility to swap the knight for this bishop, so you're not losing the piece. Let's look at knight takes here. What happens? The problem here now is that there's an attack on this knight. Also, there's an attack on this bishop. So here black recaptures the piece, and now there's two pieces being attacked. This knight by the pawn and the bishop. So black is going to win material. If the knight retreats, well, even if bishop takes here again, the threat on two pieces remain even when you take back. If the knight goes back to c3, defending the bishop and saving itself, bishop to a2 finishes the game. King takes back, whatever, either way, you're going to play queen h4, so king had to take, but either way, knight f3 check, and when the pawn takes back, you've got the infiltration of the queen with check. The bishop is taken here, it's defended, well, not that it needs to be defended, and it's checkmate to follow very soon. And in this position, after the knight takes in e4, even if white goes for the pawn now, look how well placed our pieces are in the center. There's no way that there's no tactic here. Of course, now the queen's attacking the knight. There's two knights in the center. It looks like white is also well placed, but still black takes the bishop. And when the queen takes back, you're going to take this bishop. There's no compensation. There's absolutely no scary checks or anything here. Black is winning. So from the start, we play this three knights game, f5, pawn takes, knight f6, bishop to b5, and now we attack the knight. So we're looking at the variation knight to g5, there's double attack on the pawn. Okay, we play d5. We're going to look one more time at this d3 move, h6. Okay, knight to h3, that's what we're looking at now. And we recapture this pawn. So after knight back in the game with knight f4, bishop to d6. What happens if, as you might have noticed in the previous variation, the white player goes on to win the pawn in d5? Okay, we take the knight, knight takes back. And now castle. And the white player is in trouble because this knight is about to become a monster. So what happens if white takes this bishop, this knight, and doubles up and isolates our pawns? Knight goes back to c3. We are doing just fine here because now we take the pawn. We're gonna isolate the pawn. The queen cannot take it, so it has to take with the pawn. But now queen e8 check. It's already so much better for the black player. This is a thematic type of check because you're gonna go to g6 and put more pressure on the isolated pawn. So for example, if white blocks it like that, queen to g6, it's just winning, so winning for black. We got the bishop pair. This pawn cannot be saved. If white just pushes it, you are going to g2 with the queen, attacking the rook. The rook has to move and you take it from here. It's completely over, obviously. You can ask for support with bishop to h3 and then put more attack over the rook and win at least the exchange, if not the game. And in this position after the check, if instead, well, queen to e2 runs into queen g6 anyway, and you're going to win because rook e8 should do the job. You're also threatening bishop takes pawn, and you're also threatening queen g2. It's completely over. So what happens after, instead of queen e2, king to f1? Again, queen to g6, thematic. Let's look at this type of idea, knight to e4. In this case, we're not able to pin the knight or anything like that. Is this possible? Okay, we take the knight. Pawn takes back. And now rook to f2. Boom! It's an incredible move. This is an incredible check. You're also threatening queen to g2, so the king has to take. But now rook to f8 check. Exploiting the uncastled king. And after king to e1, queen to g2, attacking the rook and threatening checkmate. It's unstoppable. So from the start, we're going to look at another line. Pawn takes and knight f6. Okay, we're looking at the pseudo Spanish. Okay, attack the knight, knight to g5 and now d5. Let's quickly mention h4 now by white and understand what's wrong with that. So h4, the idea obviously is that if you attack the knight can go to h3 and it's supported by the rook, so that the white player doesn't have to worry about an idea like bishop to h3 smashing the king side. So here, well, first of all, recapture this pawn. And after d3, you just play bishop to g4. So remember, when you have this pattern, remember, don't memorize moves. Just memorize the patterns. This pawn, you have a pawn in e4 attacking f3. When you have sufficient attack over f3, the move bishop g4 becomes super strong because it forces the queen to go to d2, blocks the natural development of this bishop, and yeah, it's amazing. If white plays f3 because there's enough attackers, still you just take the pawn, and a move like pawn takes is met by bishop back to d7. We have achieved quite a lot of damage in the opponent territory. If not, if white takes with the knight, then go on with development. Bishop to e7. Position is already evaluated as if black was up a piece or something. So that tells you a lot. Development. Okay, well, castling this side would be stupid because after moving this knight, there will be eternal pressure on the pawn in h4. Cannot be fixed. Pushing the pawns means that white cannot castle because then the bishop will take the pawn. We've all fallen for that kind of stuff at some point. But let's see. Development. The idea of maybe castling long side. Okay. Castle, and after queen to d2, of course queen to e2 just remains, you're still pinning, and also the rook to e8 becomes a very strong threat, so queen to d2 still. Now we take the knight and create this damage. We're happy to give the bishop in order to create this damage. Top recommendation by the engine. And now knight to d4 is really strong. You might take the opponent bishop pair away, or the pawn in f3 with an attack on the king and queen if your opponent is particularly stupid. And we're going to close the line here because this h4 move is more rare and it doesn't really have that much of a purpose. Okay, one more mention I need to make before closing this video is the one with knight e6. So the three knights, f5, pawn takes, knight f6. So white tries to bring the game into some sort of Spanish looking game if that's what he likes to play. Well, okay, you know your theory, white doesn't. e4, knight g5 and now d5. What happens after? Okay, well, d3 and now h6. What happens when white plays knight to e6? This is, it looks solid and it's actually the best move, but it still goes fine for black, because pawn takes back, and now queen to d6 puts pressure on that pawn, and we should be able to win it. Our opponent will have to walk the extra mile in order not to lose that pawn, but there's no point. Let's see how wrong things can go. Let's say white now takes the pawn in e4. Just to make an example, queen takes e6. We got double attack over the pawn. The pawn cannot move, it's pinned. Knight moving to d5 is a massive blunder because queen e4 check, and you have double attack here, so you're winning material. Knight going back, but then you have queen b4 check and taking this bishop. So the best move according to the engine would be castle. Okay, now we take this pawn, and we have our glorious pawn in e4 attacking f3 and d3. So rook to e1, putting more pressure on it. Maybe idea of playing f3. But nothing works. Now black plays bishop to b4, pins the knight to the rook. That's very important. And after bishop to d2, unpinning it. Well, this is a bad move because black will long castle and put pressure on the bishop, making it unable to move. But there was really nothing else to do because you're planning to take the knight, smash the pawn structure, and then just castle and carry on with the game. And black is better. So let's look at this move, bishop d2, which keeps the pawn structure safe unless white wants to give up the exchange. What happens after queen e2 to finalize the pressure over this pawn? Well, that loses immediately to knight d4, okay? Two attackers here, you're threatening to take the knight and then take the bishop. Game over. And even then, the queen remains to the defense of the bishop, but you also have the possibility to play knight to c2 with an attack on both rooks. So that's not possible. What happens if instead white first takes our knight? We take with the queen, keeping our pawn structure safe. We still have attack over e4, so we don't have to worry. And now, does queen e2 work to finally capitalize on that pawn? No, because we're going to play a6, stopping the attempt of swapping queens, which will be crucial for white in an attempt of capturing this pawn. This pawn is really strong. Remember, this pawn is, if there's something you're taking away with this video, apart from the terrible quality of the audio and the video, at least take this pawn with you. Try to understand the value of that pawn and all the patterns that you will remember with this pawn. The pressure that we keep over f3 is so crucial. Now, in fact, white cannot take here, obviously, because then rook h to e8 wins the game. We're threatening to win the knight for free. And when the bishop takes our bishop, then remember, rook takes, and you're also attacking the bishop, just to make an example. You know, you're up material, you're winning. There's no sufficient zook here or anything. So from the start, the last thing I'm going to mention is that after knight c3, f5, pawn takes, knight f6, and bishop to b5, e4, what happens when white takes the knight with the bishop? This is now, well, okay, go and watch all of the videos about how to master the Schliemann Gambit and beat the Spanish opening of them, plenty of those videos. Take with the d pawn. It's very similar to that, but there's something slightly different that has to be addressed. After that, queen e2, pinning the pawn is the best move. Queen e7 is the best thing you can do. What happens after knight to h4, which is an annoying move that protects this pawn, stops us from actually recapturing it. Because there's no way to kick this knight away. We can't really play g5. Not in this position. Okay, go on with bishop to d7. And after castle. And castle. And d3. Only way to develop this bishop. Take. And after take, black's best move, a thematic move, is queen to b4, attacking this knight. And the idea is exploit the knight in c3 for the blocked c2 pawn and target it later on. So after knight back to f3, queen to a5, putting more pressure on this pawn, and we are going to win it. Unless white wants to play knight to d4, but that's really stupid because this bishop just has to move, and then there will be a pin on the queen. So what happens here after the development? Let's say bishop to g5, pinning our knight. Okay, well, bishop takes to in f5, and after the best move, queen to e2, saving itself from the rook, from the bishop. Black continues with the thematic a3. This is a beautiful move because it forces the smashing of this pawn structure. The knight can't just move away because he will take it, and if he goes somewhere else, you still have an attack on the pawn in b2. Yeah, knight to d1, but you also have, potentially you have also rook e8 attacking the queen. There's nowhere to go for the queen, really. Nowhere that makes sense. So after pawn takes on bishop, then we take the knight. There is no way to stop us from taking this pawn as well. Because we're also attacking the pawn in a3. Black king is completely safe. If rook to d1, for instance, best move is rook takes, queen here, swap everything. Also attacking here in a2.